My name is Douglas Kill, Kill. I've been with the Michigan State Police for 29 years. I started out as a trooper for 10 years, and then a desk sergeant for about a year and a half. And I became a detective sergeant in 2001. During that time, I was a crime scene technician, trooper investigator, which I would assist detectives in investigations. Once I became a detective, I've been on the Berrien County Homicide Task Force for about 17, 18 years. And I also was a member of the FBI Violent Crimes Task Force also. When I became a detective back in 2001, when I first became a detective there, your caseload is pretty light at that time. And of course, there was two of us at the Bridgman post. So I started going through all the cold case files, looking to see what was there and kind of familiarize myself with everything that was, in our archives and that type of thing. And one of the cases I looked at was the missing person of Cathy Davidson. And I read through that, and it sure seemed like there was a lot of unanswered questions. And after reading it, it seemed there's something suspicious about that. And I thought, well, probably since it's been 35, 40 years, should probably go back and re-interview the children, and because some of them were, teens, like 18, 16, 18, 14 at that time.
Right.
And they would be probably good witnesses to re-interview and see, if there's any discrepancies in the original stories. And of course, as I was looking at that, things come up, pending cases arise, and it kind of got put back on the shelf. And then in 2011, we closed that post, and everything got boxed up and shipped away.
It got boxed up. Then where does the box go from there?
Well, the box was put in archives in the basement here, and back in 2017, I got a call from one of the FBI agents here in town, and one of the siblings who was born after Catherine disappeared had discussed, her, I guess, missing younger sibling with the other children at the house, and became aware of what had happened, and took it upon herself in 2017, I think she was in her 30s or 40s at that time, to call the mother of the actual child of Catherine and tell her what she knew. And then, in fact, the mother of Catherine went to the FBI and told them what she had been told, and then it goes to the FBI. Then they found out we had the original case. It went to headquarters in Lansing, where they decided that it would be down here. They ended up calling me and says, "Yeah, I know where that case is at. It's in the basement here." So I grabbed it out, and we started working on it.
Detective Kill and I talked about a great many things related to Cathy's case, and you're going to hear our full interview in this episode. But let me get you up to speed first. The Davidsons left Warren Dunes without Cathy, and police would continue the investigation well into the next year, following every tenuous lead and tip, which generally meant checking into every sex offender and child predator that hit their radar in the month to come. Just before the Davidsons returned home, Robert Davidson called the police post and asked the sergeant to contact Chicago PD. He wanted them to stake out their house. He alleged that a man had been there earlier that day talking to his children. The authorities conferred, and it was decided that if Chicago PD was to be summoned at all, it should be done by the family. As with most cases that garner a local high profile, there were psychics that contacted police with information, but nothing panned out there either. Then, on September 28th, 27 days after Cathy went missing, police received a call from Al Johnson, a member of the black news media out of Chicago. He was one of the men with the group of reporters who had come previously, the day the children had been interviewed by police. The reporter had done some digging locally in Chicago, and he had the following information to share. He said Uncle Marvin Bobo, Anna's brother, who had allegedly been with them that day Cathy went missing, was an ex-con, and so was Robert Davidson, her father, although I am certain police were aware of both of their criminal records by then. Johnson advised that he had learned through his investigation that the two men were involved in selling narcotics at Governor State University, although they had never been busted for it there. He learned that 3 weeks before Cathy went missing, Robert Davidson and Marvin Bobo were broke. And one day they had raised all kinds of trouble at the university office, throwing things around and overturning a desk. Apparently, Anna received some sort of subsistence from the university, and that was the reason for the hubbub, a problem with them getting the money. Not long after that information came in, police got another call, this time from an ex-husband of Anna's, who told them that she had been arrested for beating his 5-year-old daughter, her stepchild, in 1968, a few years before Cathy went missing in 1973. So this ex-husband, and his last name was Molden, told police that Anna spent several days in the county jail and then 2 weeks in some type of hospital for the mentally disturbed. When he read about Cathy going missing in the Chicago Today newspaper, something told him his information might be helpful to the case. Now you have to remember that back in the early 70s, police couldn't just quickly pull up a computer to cross-check prior crimes that had been perpetrated in other states by a person of interest. It was a lot more difficult to connect the dots back then. They often relied on calls like this to lead them in the right direction. So the investigator on Cathy's case reached out to the Warren, Ohio Police Department and requested copies of everything they had on the arrest of Anna. Back then, it was Anna Molden. The report indicates that the incident in question occurred on February 2, 1968. Anna Elizabeth Molden, age 24, of Warren, Ohio, was arrested for excessive punishment. At the time of her arrest in Ohio, Anna gave a statement admitting that she beat her 5-year-old stepdaughter with a stick. The child was taken to a local hospital by her father. The doctor reported that her legs and buttocks were covered in welts and bruises. The child was admitted for observation after they took x-rays of her hips and legs to check for broken bones, and because she began voiding blood from her vagina. Think about how hard you have to hit a 5-year-old child to cause them to pee blood. Anna is 24 years old at this time, and the police report is scant. There's no narrative about the incident itself. It does note that she voluntarily agreed to enter the hospital for treatment, but according to her ex-husband, she only spent a few days in jail and a couple weeks in the hospital. With this troubling background information coming out about the parents, police still had very little to go on as far as leads that directly connected that troubling information to what may or may not have happened to Cathy Davidson. On October 16th, a month and a half after Cathy went missing, Anna Davidson called the police post at 11:07 a.m. She sounded like she had been crying and expressed concern during the interview. She asked if there were any updates on the investigation and mentioned several times that she wanted police to call them if anything developed. She asked about the possibility of Cathy being in the water, and if so, she wondered why her body had not been found. She felt that with all the swimmers in the area, someone would have seen the child. She informed police that her husband had returned to work, and then, almost offhandedly, remarked about how they had been to that park so many times in the past and never had any trouble. She acknowledged giving the police a hard time at first, but she now felt in her heart that they did all that they could at the time. The officer took the opportunity to ask if the Davidsons had learned anything new on their end from the Chicago area. Anna said that the children told the same story when they were asked, and the only thing that she could think of that was new was that her little son, the other 6-year-old, had specifically mentioned seeing Cathy stomping her feet in the water. There was nothing else learned in that call, and the case had stalled on the Michigan end, although they had asked Chicago police to partner with them in getting background information on the Davidsons, given what they had learned from Anna's ex-husband. Michigan wanted the Chicago PD to ascertain whether Cathy ever showed signs of beatings or neglect. They wanted her friends, teachers, and neighbors interviewed. Michigan forwarded everything they had to the Chicago PD, along with all the newspaper clippings and the other arrest report on Anna from the Warren, Ohio Police Department, so they were both on the same page. The next note in the Michigan State Police report is from the following year, in July of 1975. A trooper, of all people, remarked that several of his friends said they had read in the Michigan City News-Dispatch that the missing child had been found buried in the basement of the Davidsons' residence in Chicago, and that the father had been convicted of manslaughter, although the friends were unable to recall the date or the time of year that they had read the alleged article in the paper. The New Buffalo Post detective contacted Chicago PD, and they said they had no new information involving any homicide of Cathy Davidson. The trooper then called the Michigan City News-Dispatch and spoke to a reporter, and he didn't recall any article involving a homicide in Chicago of this child. But where did this come from? These whispers about a basement and murder? Particularly when, in November of 1976, 3 years after Cathy went missing, the final notation on the page reads as follows: "As of this time, there have not been any new developments on this case. Catherine Davidson is still missing. All investigative leads have been followed up and have reached a dead end. This complaint will be reopened if any new leads are developed." The case status was then listed as closed.
What happened was I ended up partnering with the FBI on this because their resources are much greater than ours.
Mm-hmm.
And the FBI agent here, she was awesome. She grabbed one of their little analysts there at their office and started tracking these people down using their resources, and found out where all of them lived. And they ended up sending out leads, and then those people were all re-interviewed
Okay.
by the FBI, and then I re-interviewed some of them by phone after that, because they're spread out all over the country.
Let's go back to the initial investigation. So what I was first impressed by was how many resources was put into the search efforts in the early hours, because it seems that when the first patrol person got on scene, it was very quickly, okay, we're not going to stand here and do a lot of talking. We're going to get people on the ground and start looking for this little girl. And it went for days. I mean, there was air search, there was ground search. It was just days and days. And then there was days of looking into other suspicious people, pedophiles, missing children. And what I was struck by is as the time went on, it was hard for police to get the parents to sort of sit down for a formal interview. Every time they went to try to speak with them, there was a group of people there sort of injecting themselves, and it felt uncomfortable to read. So I can't even imagine being an investigator trying to ask questions of witnesses, and there's people, butting in, and reporters with their recorders there. Explain for the listener the importance of police getting witnesses into the post, into the station in a room where it's quiet, and interviewing them. What's the importance of that?
Well, the importance at first is the timeliness of all that. You want to get to your interviews and get as much information gathered as quickly as possible to get that out to the searchers, and just things that you want to know, what's going on and what happened, and the times of all this. And it seemed to me, after reading this, as they put things off and made the children unavailable for interviews, it didn't sit well. But then you had a lot of interference with all these outside people coming in, reporters and people wanting to ask questions, and you want to get people into an environment where it's quiet and you can be one-on-one with them and not have more than one person, with a barrage of questions coming at these children. And it just wasn't made available. It seemed like there was a lot of interference going on during that time, just from what I read in the original report.
There was a lot of pointing at a birth mother, or pointing in other directions, or whenever the officer would ask a question, let's say about any background information, they didn't seem to want to answer any background information at all. They just wanted to, well, did you check the storm drains, or did you check this, or did you check that? Does that sort of thing throw up red flags for police when you're questioning family members or witnesses?
It does. It's almost like they're trying to lead your investigation and send you in different directions when normally you get a kind of a flavor of what's going on and you kind of focus on what's happening at the time. And if people are trying to direct you off in different directions, it kind of sends up a red flag on that, especially if they're not being very cooperative.
Right. It was sort of a pylon to me. I really got that sense. Um, so when it was days later, right? When they finally got the children in there, it was
It
many
was
days.
2 weeks later.
Oh my gosh.
The initial incident occurred on September 1st. The children were interviewed on September 14th.
I mean, if I just think about my own kids at that age, even in teens and young, and just trying to sit them down and get them to tell me something that happened a day or so ago, that would be difficult enough. But that just seems like you've lost so much not being able to talk to them right away.
Yes, you'd want to talk to them immediately. What did you see? Where were you at? You know, when did you last see Catherine, and where was she at when you saw her? Those things are important on a missing person because you want to actually talk to the last person who saw the missing person alive, and where were they at? Who was around there? There's a ton of information that couldn't be gathered because the children were made unavailable for almost 2 weeks.
So, did anything stand out um, to you when you read all the statements, when you just the children's statements, and then the parent statements? What they said, was there anything that stood out to you about those statements?
Well, for one thing, it was when the children were interviewed, they all had the exact same description of the clothing that Catherine was wearing. And in my experience, children don't pay attention to that sort of thing unless they're the ones that dressed them. But some what I read, Catherine dressed herself.
Right.
And then the trip up when some of the drivers, or the brother of the stepmother, said they didn't stop anywhere, but then the parents are saying, yeah, they stopped for chicken and some other things on the way up. Differences in the stories like that kind of stand out. I mean, these are adults telling you this now, not the children, because you expect children not to have the same story because they just don't pay attention to that sort of thing. I mean, they're observant and that type of thing, but I think they're really going to remember the clothing.
Yeah, and that's kind of what stood out to me is that I didn't expect them all to have the exact same story. I couldn't get probably my whole family to agree on one thing if they all saw it, and that their stories were so like word for word. It was we jumped out of the car, we ran down to the water, and on the way, no, we didn't stop anywhere. That stop for chicken. That the parents were the only ones that mentioned them stopping for chicken, and none of the children mentioning. And that to me, that was almost one of the biggest ones because if they stopped for chicken. Here's my two schools of thought on that. Either they did or they didn't. If they stopped for chicken, I would expect at least one of them to say, yeah, we stopped. If they didn't and the parents are being untruthful, what it feels like is that there was a situation where maybe their statements were coached and that was a question that they did not anticipate. Was that your feeling? Did you have a feeling that they did or didn't stop? What was your feeling when you heard that or when you read that?
Well, I would think that because one of the adult children actually drove. There was the parents, the brother, and one of the younger children, who was 18 at the time, drove. I think he would have mentioned if they stopped because they traveled together,
right,
in 3 cars. So you'd think we stopped here for chicken.
So besides them all having the same sort of description of the clothing, which was exact word for word, every one of them. Is there anything else that stood out that felt? I don't want to put words in your mouth. I felt that it sounded coached. Is there anything that stood out to you that made it feel like that those kids might have been coached in some way?
Just that the fact that their story was just so similar that they got out, they ran down, and all of a sudden everybody is separated from the parents and the adults right at the beginning. It's just too similar. Kids remember things differently, and I think it's just from what I read in it, there's just too much to it. And I actually talked to one of the original investigators who's still in the area on this when I first started looking into it back in 2017, and he believes that there was something else going on, that the parents weren't being truthful from the beginning.
Yeah, but even saying that, it's not like the officer just went and thought that and didn't do anything else and got tunnel vision, because so much was done that nobody didn't know. If they didn't have the police report, they wouldn't know all the weirdos and pedophiles and people that were checked into out of state and in state, and I mean all the canvassing in the area. There was a lot done, and I want to make sure that the public doesn't get the wrong impression, because there was a lot done in that regard. It was that the police didn't just look at the parents and think, because there was a situation where they found the parents one night, the first night I believe it was, drinking beer with another couple right there, and they weren't out searching. They were
sitting in a car with another couple drinking and laughing, and that doesn't sound like a distraught parent to me, especially on the very first night that your child's gone missing.
Yeah, that was another red flag. But even seeing that, they didn't just start ramming down their doors. They were doing all the other things to make sure that they could rule anything else out while still trying to get information. I think what is your sense of why it sort of stalled? What is your sense of why if they think in their head, okay, there's something sort of fishy going on, what would they have needed to get past that hump?
Well, it stalled because they've ran down every lead that came in. I mean, I've looked through this, and anything that came in, no matter how far-fetched it was, even the fact that there were a couple of missing escaped mental patients, I believe, in Indiana that they tracked down, and you just run out of leads, and there's no body left. There really isn't much else you can do. I mean, they've done the nationwide alerts, and back in the 70s that was quite a feat, because you don't have the Amber Alerts like you have now, where information just goes out nationwide. This thing, back then it went by teletype, and it was basically just all written word.
Right.
And they ran everything down, and it just, after I think 3 years they did this, or 3 or 4 years, it just stalls when you run out of things to look at. And of course, you have other investigations that are pending that come up, and you have to set this one aside and work on the pending stuff also.
And then in October of 1977, the Warren Police Department received an anonymous letter. And basically, what can you tell me about that letter?
Well, that letter was an anonymous letter that went to Warren Police Department in Michigan, which is kind of, I don't know if they meant it for Warren Dunes or Warren, Ohio, because the stepmother had been arrested in Warren, Ohio on a charge. So it's kind of odd that it went there. But it's 4 pages. I got it sitting right here, the original letter sitting right here. 4 pages front and back, telling that it was all a lie, and that she was actually dead and never made it to Warren Dunes. And it's quite detailed, but it's written so, I mean, the handwriting's changed quite a bit in this, and come to find out later on it was done on purpose.
I was wondering if the person that wrote it had done that. And also the language in it, you could sort of tell it was, someone that was younger versus someone that was older. I felt like when I was reading it, I looked at it and I thought, okay, so if I was a police officer, what am I going to use from this to find out who wrote it? Were they able to do anything to sort of track down the author at the time? Was there anything to even go on?
Not really, because everything in here it talks about the family. I think you've probably read it, and that the husband had been was into drugs and that type of thing, and it, if you don't have the author of it, how do you confirm anything that's actually in here?
Right.
If it's something somebody had wrote, and you're right, it was written by a younger person back when it was written in 1977. But if you have nothing to go on, are you going to confront the parents on, okay, this is what they say? I mean, you could, but that's not going to help. Just accusing people of things.
And then it's going to give them. It's going to tell them what you've got. It's going to sort of, reveal that you've got this piece of information that you might need a little bit later. The only thing that jumped out at me was the description of, because the person that wrote it seemed to sort of fake how they saw it that day, and we'll get to a little in a minute. But it mentioned the proximity to someone else living behind the house or something. Do you know if the Chicago PD did any canvassing in that area? I know that the Michigan State Police had asked them to look for some background information at one point. What can you tell me about what they may have done?
From what I could find out, it doesn't appear that they did any. Chicago police didn't do anything with the neighbors on this. It doesn't appear that I read anything. I come to find out after talking to the author, that was kind of a ruse. This wasn't observed by a neighbor anyway.
Right, correct.
From what I could see, that there really isn't any neighbors that had a view of what the author of this letter was talking about anyway.
So maybe they did at least go down and look, and that's what they realized. There's no way to look and see what he's saying. Maybe it's a possibility. I did send for some reports from the Chicago PD. I sent a FOIA request, so I'll see what I can get from there, because a lot of the documents that I got were from Florida. So there were their records laws are a lot less stringent than, say, in Michigan. So they have what's called the Sunshine Law, and I have a lot of the stuff from the House of Prayer side of the investigation, but there was some of the stuff that had to do with Cathy and some questions, because there was a little overlap. They'd go to question someone about one thing, and then they'd ask about if they knew anything about Cathy's case too. Okay, so without using any names, in 2017, the identity of the letter writer is learned, and this person gives an account of what happened to Cathy that day, as well as a description of how it was a ruse, how she was dead before they even went to Warren Dunes. And there are some other secondhand witness statements that suggest that Anna's brother and Robert Davidson took Cathy's body and buried her somewhere in the Chicago or the outlying area. Both of these men are deceased now. Do you know if there's been any physical searches for Cathy, and if so, why not?
Well, none that I'm aware of, and the reason would be where would you start looking? I mean, the young man that I talked to who wrote this letter only has an opinion. He doesn't have any fact. He thinks it was a landfill based on just the amount of time that they were gone when they left with Catherine's body. But, that was 40 years ago, over 40 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's something that people don't necessarily understand when they say, "Oh, you've got a lead on where to go look." Well, you can't send people just to anywhere. Where are they going to go? If he thinks that the person was back, they left and were back within a 20 or 30 minute time, what are you going to do? Search everything within a 20 or 30 mile radius? It's impossible.
Exactly. They could have put her body in a dumpster. They could have drove it someplace and buried it. You just don't know. There's no indication from anyone of exactly where she would be. If that was known, or just specific area, certainly we would be out looking. I mean, Chicago PD has a lot of resources. The FBI has offered all of their resources. So has the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They're involved with this, and they have offered all their resources in any capacity that we need to help try and find her.
So let's say she was buried somewhere and someone stumbles across her remains. What would happen? What kind of chances do you give her case if Cathy is found?
Well, the first thing we did was we got DNA from her biological mother and her biological sister. And their sister would have the DNA from both Catherine's father and mother. So should her remains be found, they would be able to connect the DNA. If she is found, and you're talking about maybe charging someone with their death, there's a lot of proof that goes into that. First of all, venue, where would she actually died at? How did she die? And at whose hand? You'd have to prove all of that. And most of the witnesses that were actually there are deceased, and if the other person's not talking, how do you prove it in a court of law? I mean, people have rights, and if you're going to accuse somebody, you need proof.
Yeah, that's the thing that drew me to this case, is that I sort of felt this poor little girl wasn't, she wasn't going to get most likely wasn't going to get the justice that we generally assume is justice in a court of law because of how tough it is. It would have to be someone who saw something firsthand, and you'd have to have enough. And it just seems like this is a really difficult one. But and then I started to think about the Florida cases that her stepmother has been arrested by Alachua County for other crimes that it turns out, and I'll outline all this in the podcast. What I was wondering is, do you know if what happened to Cathy would somehow come into a case involving her stepmother and other children? Is that something that they can use as far as to show some sort of pattern of behavior?
That's up to the court. If she does make it to trial and they want to use past her history of arrests and abusing other children, which is documented in some cases, that's up to the court to allow that in testimony. That's in Florida. I can't even speak for Michigan. That's up to the attorneys and the judge to hash out if that would even be allowed in court.
The one other thing I thought of, I wanted to ask about is the one thing I noticed is that Anna Davidson did not appear to do the same types of things to her natural children, the children that were born to her, if you believe their statement saying that they were never abused and none of them ever died. It seemed as though she was physically abusive to stepchildren and then to children at this house of prayer. From a law enforcement perspective, what does that say to you? What can you say about that?
Well, just from what I've read in our case and the Alachua County Sheriff's Department case, it sure seems, and actually the people I've talked to that lived through this, she was quite abusive to the non-biological children. And her own children were treated very well. Some of the kids that I've talked to couldn't wait to get out of the house when they turned 18 because of the abuse, the mental and physical abuse that they at the hands of her, the stepmother.
Yeah, and to me, I think when I hear that, that's not someone who flies off the handle and gets frustrated and abuses. That's someone with a little bit more of a intent. It's someone who is picking and choosing their victims. And that makes it almost even worse. There's no excuse. She doesn't have some sort of mental incapacity that would excuse it. She's setting her sights on someone and selectively choosing victims to abuse.
Yes, it seems like all the directed anger was at the non-biological children. Even so, when I talk to most of the children that were at the beach, the biological children stick with the story.
Uh-huh.
The non-biological children say, yeah, it was a ruse. She never went with us. And I talked to some of the suspect's family members, extended family, and the ex-wife of her brother, and the story is told basically that she was dead and never went to the beach that day.
Yeah, I mean the story is clear from the witnesses that aren't blood related. Clearly, can pretty much outline what happened all the way through from her being put in that closet, not even, before that weekend,
Right.
and being taken out and being disoriented and then putting back in there again. And I kept thinking, my God, was she like in that closet all week? How long was this poor girl in that closet, and how much did these kids see and are not admitting? It's horrific.
And what was the weather then? Was it hot, humid, and stifling hot inside this little linen closet? And the kids had to have seen a lot more than what they're telling.
Yeah, and even through some of the statements that I've read, they do know. Some of them do know, because that's how we found out information, just from reading those reports. She was heard from that closet, scratching on the wall. I mean, that's horrific. I can't even imagine not, knowing that and not saying anything.
Yeah, she was even let out of the closet by one of the children, and then once the stepmother found out, put her right back in.
We're talking about a little 6-year-old girl. This is a little girl. She's, and what I don't understand is the father's not intervening. Nobody's doing anything. Not a single person in that house is advocating for that child, except for the ones that are non-related. And when they do, they're punished. It's
Yes, exactly.
it's unbelievable. It's horrible, and that's why I wanted to do this, because if she doesn't get justice in a court of law, at least I'd like to have her story out there. At least that much, I think, is important. Is there anything else about this case that I've missed, or any questions, or anything that you think I need to note?
Well, just the fact that the FBI agent and I did travel to Florida to interview the stepmother, and basically it was, this is what we're told happened by multiple people. Can you just tell us where she is, and so we can recover her and give her the proper burial that she deserves, because her biological mother is still alive and would like to see that. And we tried to stress that as much as we could, and it really didn't go anywhere.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. Do you think that that Anna knows where she is? Where Cathy's body is?
That's a 50-50 bet. I would think that somebody as controlling as she is would know. It's not like she was out of control and think everybody did everything. Everything was done at her command, and that's what I believe. I believe she has to know.
I hadn't thought of that, but you're absolutely right. Everyone that's talked about from the House of Prayer said she ran that place. Everyone did. Even her husband told her she told everyone what to do. She was the leader, the ringleader. And this wasn't something that just came on late in life. She was abusing, like you said, before Cathy. She was arrested for excessive abuse way back in her early 20s. This is something that she was always doing. She didn't just find religion and decide that sort of, abuse was part of her, part of a biblical type of disciplining. She was doing that before she found this new religion.
Right. She was quite abusive. The things that I've read that the Alachua County Sheriff's Department has dug up, the things that she's done to other children. Starting back when she was in her 20s with the arrest out of Warren, Ohio, and just some of the things that I've read that has attributed her to the punishment of these children. She is in total control. Either she does it herself or she has somebody do it for her in punishing these children.
Well, I hope that some of the kids change, their tune and maybe come forward if there's anything that they know that could be helpful to finding Cathy. Because like you said, her mother is still alive, and if it was them and their child, they would at least want to be able to give their child a proper burial. So I hope some of those siblings, if they know, or Anna, any of them, anyone that can, has a change of heart and can lead investigators to Cathy, because that would be, I think, the most hopeful outcome that we could have, at this point for her.
Right. Even give us a general area. I mean, everybody's offered to give us the resources to help search. If we can just get a general area, we can bring out cadaver dogs and every ground penetrating radar, all that stuff to try and locate where she's at. And now that I recall, I did run this by our prosecutor's office, and they said they would not prosecute on this because of the factors that we discussed earlier. Mm. So when I brought this up to the stepmother at this, when we interviewed her, I tried to express that to her, and I said if she didn't want to tell me where the body was at, tell her attorney, so at least there's some sort of record on it.
So when she dies, you're right. I've seen stories like that where serial killers even have written things down, and then their lawyers pass that information along years later. That, you'd think someone that says that they believe in God, as much as she's always proclaiming to believe in God, would know that the very least that she could do was some justice to that little girl. So I hope that if her children are listening to the podcast, if she gets wind of it, I hope her children especially could maybe, even in quiet moments, talking to her would maybe convince her, to at least do that much. We can only hope, I guess.
Yeah, that's the very least we can hope for this. I mean, to this day, she remains a missing person, and we would just like to recover her, and for her mother and her family. She's got a sister out there, too. Right. And I want to see her brought back.
thank you so much for doing this. I think this is so important for her because of, like we said, this is probably the most she's going to get. What's important to me is that people know the truth. And I think you and the original investigators, through having all that documented, I think you did get to the truth. I think you know basically what happened. And so I think it's important that the siblings all know what happened. If they've not been told, or if family members have not been told, maybe someone will convince someone else to do the right thing. So I appreciate you taking the time to do this so much.
No problem. Thank you for doing this. I mean, if we can get something out there that stirs something up and give me some tips of where she might be at, that'd be great. We'll go looking.
The letter was handwritten, not signed, and it came in an envelope addressed to the Warren Police Department. This is what the letter said.
Some time ago, a little girl, Cathy Davidson, was lost in Warren, Michigan sand dunes in the year of '73. It was said by the parents that their daughter was lost within seconds, out of nowhere. I would like to say you did, honestly, as a police force, question that, though. If the family were all on a picnic, point number 1, all of them were with her. Point number 2, a total of 7 or 8 family members. Point number 3, then it would be totally impossible for her to have been lost or kidnapped. I will remain anonymous, but since the case was never closed, if you further investigate the Davidsons to this very date, you will find out that neither of the parents, Anna Davidson and Robert Davidson, are reputable people. Mr. Robert Davidson served time for armed robbery with his wife's brother, Marvin Bobo, Anna's maiden name. Both were incarcerated for the same in Detroit, Michigan, and once cellmates for 6 years. Marvin Bobo, since 14, was in and out of reformatory. Not until he was 29 was he released. To this very day, Marvin Bobo has been charged several times of narcotics charges. The mother, Step, has an unreputable condition also. Married several times. Number 1, maiden name Anna Bobo, Detroit birthplace. Number 2, Anna McDuffie, first husband. Number 3, Anna Rollins, second husband. Number 4, third husband, first name John, last unknown. Number 5, Anna Robinson, fourth husband. Number 6, Anna Davidson, fifth husband, name to whom is Robert Davidson. The young girl, Cathy Davidson, was seen 3 days before the Saturday this happened, with bruises, cuts, and scars. When asked, her mother had beaten her that summer, previously. By investigation, a report was received this child had been terrified when visiting in Detroit. Her father openly hit the child with a board in the head because the child, Cathy, and a little boy were playing in the nude under a house stairway. That Saturday morning before the Davidsons left, Cathy Davidson, from watching my window, did not go with them on that trip. I know this is a fact. What I did see was her husband and another guy drive their car on the side of the house, open the car trunk, and put a clothes bag, plaid, blue, and black, from out their back window over the gate. I will not say or come forth unless this is further investigated, but if you ask why I didn't come forth, and how do I know, my house is in back of theirs and Cathy was my friend. She was only 6 years old, as the same as I was sick, too. Please believe me. I'm sure, as much as it has been on their family conscience, at least one would confess. Also, I was at least hoping the girl's body would be found in Chicago, nearby, within distance. I'm sure Mr. Robert Davidson knows where his daughter's body is.
This letter comes off as something that was written by someone who was younger. There are words that are miswritten, like mother step and family conscious instead of conscience, using the word terrify instead of terrified. Some of the sentences are confusing, like she was only 6 years old, as the same as I was sick too. And there were also some efforts to disguise the handwriting, which was learned later. So what was going on in the lives of Anna and Robert Davidson around this time? October of 1977. when this letter was making its way across the country? Well, for one thing, Anna Davidson was pregnant. In March of 1978, she would give birth to a little girl named Joy. And none of them would have any way of knowing that that little girl, who wasn't even born when Cathy went missing, would grow up to be the reason the case of the sister she never knew would be reopened decades later. That little girl grew into a woman who became the only member of the family whose voice would ring out for justice. And it would come to be the voice of all the children. You see, it wasn't just Cathy. There were others. And Joy's voice would bring theirs back to life. Stay tuned.